Autumn Gardens of Kyoto, Part 2. In this Part 2 of Autumn Gardens of Kyoto, we begin with the Muromachi period, the beginning of the Zen gardens and gardeners, Soseki and his moss garden, and the Kinkaku-ji Zen Temple, golden pavilion, by a particular shogun. Ryoan-ji, peaceful dragon temple, done by Soami and his karesansui, dry sand garden, and his Daisen-in Temple as well, the most symbolic garden of all. Then we go to the Momoyama period, and the Japanese tea ceremony, Chanoyu, is introduced. Zen priests, Zen masters, master gardeners, all in one for many, many people, like Sen-no-Rikkyu, Tokei, and Kobori Enshu. He invented the shakkei technique.
And so the garden connection. To aid enlightenment, gardens were set up in and around Zen monasteries like this one at Tofukuji, which had just then recently been founded. Gardens were not ends in themselves anymore. They were spaces filled in a certain way. There was a return to naturalness and a celebration of nature itself. Tofukuji Gardens from 1235. Zen art turned away from the supernatural and the symmetrical and the colorful ostentation of the earlier Buddhist art. For garden making, it helped bring the ideal image out of the heavens and down to earth. It emphasized the natural, the asymmetric, and the neutral compositions of art. The monochrome compositions of nature were to be studied. So Zen began to influence all of Japanese culture at this point. Single color compositions, as nature so often has it. That was the point. Art historians say it's almost impossible to speak of Japanese art without speaking of Zen. This art of Zen mostly did away with the elaborate Buddhist pantheon and concentrated on trying to capture the essence or spirit of things. Neutral landscapes were preferred, rather than brilliant pictures of paradise. Very often the same monk was both painter and garden maker, like Soami, and obviously the two art forms shared much in terms of style and technique. These are paintings by Soami with the orange background in the Nara Museum. I'll be mentioning him again. In painting, Japanese art became more and more abstract as the monk painters sought to bring out only the essential qualities of their subjects. A single brush stroke could represent a massive mountain or the beak of a sparrow. So under the influence of Zen, by the late 1200s, the basic principles of the new Japanese aesthetics had been established. I'd like to mention a couple of the old gardener priests and take a look at some specific temple gardens which they built. Muzo Soseki was undoubtedly the most important figure in medieval garden design. This is said to be a portrait of him. He was a Zen priest and one of the designers who wanted to interpret the Sansui painting style. A portrait here made to honor him. He probably would have disliked the ostentation of it. His gardens include these moss gardens at Saiho-ji, outside Kyoto. He transformed this garden from the older lotus pond pavilion style of the Pure Land sect into a new Zen kind of style. He took out the Shinden pavilions, changed the buildings, and broke up the pond with a network of islands. So from Shinden style to Zen style, Soseki began the transition. This is the layout of it, with the trees drawn in, quite asymmetric. The pond is now creatively broken up by islands and peninsulas. And here, without the trees, Golden Pond, the lower and upper gardens, dry waterfall, turtle stone composition, steps go from one level up to another. Zen gardens became private, a place for the priests to go alone, uninterrupted, to meditate, to gain enlightenment. Wonderful carpeting of moss, sparsely placed trees, shadows. This is even called the Kokudera, meaning moss temple. The garden is screened off from the world by walls or stands of bamboo like this. Towering groves of bamboo. Priest Soseki used rocks and garden space in a new way to aid his role as a teacher. The rocks were a catalyst to thought, a guide during meditation. The gardens became places for personal discoveries. A cross-section of this moss garden temple, at the right and to the left. Although a lot of it has changed from the original, the garden of Saiho-ji is one of the oldest surviving gardens in all of Japan. Temples have occupied the same sites since the 8th century. The garden and pond have been changed by periodic floods over the years, however. Today the garden has a rustic, overgrown kind of beauty. Saiho-ji Garden covers over 4.5 acres set against a forested hillside. It seems to continue up into the woods without boundary. It gives one the overall impression of being in a deep, spacious forest surrounded by a sea of green. The majority of trees in the garden are not trained to specific shapes, as in later gardens, but are allowed to grow naturally. The nickname Moss Garden comes from the numerous types of moss covering most of the garden floor. Japanese art of the earth, a kind of Sansui or mountain and water garden. A lush miniature landscape carpets the ground. There are more than 100 different kinds of mosses here. This is imaginary dry waterfalls flowing down over the well-placed rocks. Yang meaning mountain and yin meaning water. And in Japan, that's Sansui, mountain and water garden. Towering overhead, a ceiling of broad greenery keeps the garden in perpetual shade. There's a clear view through many tree trunks, increasing the sense of depth really. It's very moving to be there and walk around leisurely, to meditate. Very powerful. Now, Kinkaku-ji Zen Temple, by the third Ashikaga ruler who began Japan's Muromachi period of history. This golden pavilion, or Kinkaku-ji, used to be completely surrounded by water, connected to other buildings by a corridor which was attached to its second story, from 1394. It was originally a shinden type of structure, with its idealized pure land kind of gardens and pond. Today it's on the bank of the pond that was used for boating parties. The plan. The Golden Pavilion, Pond, and Islands. The Ashikaga clan were patrons of both the Zen sect of Buddhism and the Zen arts. Under them, Japanese culture attained new levels of sophistication. Its cross-section with pond and islands. I found this great photo from above on the web. It was the Shogun Ashikaga Yoshimitsu who built this large shinden-like compound in 1394. The ornate architecture of the Kinkaku-ji reflects a period when new Zen influences were being digested and assimilated with past forms of glory. The shogun was very interested in art and culture, and even gave up his title and built this. It seems he designed it himself too. The pines, along with the large numbers of stones that he put in, greatly increased the sense of the pond's depth. This pond has a standard southern orientation, islands of dwarf pine trees, and impressive stoneworks. It's the most interesting part of the garden, actually.
Our third Zen garden is Ryoan-ji, the most famous one, but of a very different kind. This is a wood block print of it from the 1700s. It's a very symmetrical rectangular plan, but highly asymmetric stone arrangement. It dates from the 1488.
We enter the compound, passing a small pond with rushes, berries, and pines. Ryoan-ji means Peaceful Dragon Temple. The earliest temple recorded on this site dates from 983. A lovely moss garden appears, with wonderful stones among the moss. Much like Saiho-ji at first, the moss garden. The mosses continue right up to the structure, with a small stream flowing nearby. Here is a soju, a water bamboo clacker on a pivot. As one end is filled up with water, it gets heavier and pivots and tips, letting the water out. When it returns, tipping back again, with a hollow clack sound, it hits the rock. All day, all night. Don't dream, meditate. A cross-section of Ryoan-ji, the entryway, and the stone and sand garden behind the wall where we are headed. More to the left, the rear altar building is where people sit as they observe the dry sand garden, or karesansui, and paintings inside the building reflect the imagery of the garden. It was a new kind of gardening fostered by the Zen monks about 1488. Many similar gardens were built at that time, but only Ryoan-ji has survived intact. Many people credit the painter and poet Soami for the design. The origin of this early karesansui, dry sand garden, goes back to a couple sources. We remember the pebble ground coverings of the early Shinto shrines. And then there was the simplified style of landscape painting as preferred by Zen monks. Both of these are influences. These 15 stones, arranged into 5 groups upon a rectangular bed of white sand, have provoked probably more commentary and speculation than perhaps any other single Japanese garden. They're often used to illustrate the profound mysteries found in Zen Buddhism, an example of the unique Japanese spirit. The tallest stone would be Shumasen, the center of the Buddhist universe. Some inside views in the temple, which overlooks the garden. The main altar room here. Lovely paintings adorn the sliding screens in the temple. Ink paintings that resemble the Chinese Sansui landscape art. Thick tatami mats made of soft reeds are on the floor. A mystic place, a grand setting for the stone deities. The relationship among the stone groupings is a fine example of asymmetric balance, paintings and garden alike.
One historian said, "The Shumasen rockwork of the Ryoan-ji garden symbolizes the Buddhist world where an invisible figure of Buddha is believed to exist and is worshipped." Another one, "Theories to explain the garden's mysteries appeal, ranging from the Sermon in the Stone and its occult balance, to the Japanese folk explanations of a tiger crossing the river with her cubs, or mountain tops above the clouds, or just islands in the sea. In Ryoan-ji, the wet pond is sand. Water has been eliminated completely, and karesansui, dry gardening, has developed into a technique suitable for an entire garden instead of just a single feature. The many possible meanings form a large part of its appeal, for all ages really. Ryoan-ji's overall simplicity reflects the impact of Zen and its inspired search for the essential in art.
Daisen-in is the most symbolic garden of all. It was built during the 100 Years of Civil War in the early 15th century. This is the entrance area. Zen compounds like this offered some security for people. The main building dates from 1510. The gardens from shortly after were definitely created by the Zen priest, painter, and gardener named Soami, whom I mentioned before. His landscape paintings decorate these sliding paper doors of the temple and of the quarters of the abbot, Soami. In Daisen-in, Soami's stones and plants probably were selected because they looked like the brushstroke renderings of the masters, a classic example of life imitating art. Here's the cross-section. Entrance, sand cone and bed. It is a marvelous juxtaposition of architecture and garden design. Very well integrated together. Sand and stone garden. Daisen-in resembles the typical long scroll rolled from right to left to reveal a sequential painting. It illustrates a journey through the countryside. We scan horizontally across the scene, like of a painting. It tells a kind of story. Like Ryoan-ji, it is a dry landscape garden that takes its form from ink monochrome landscape paintings, Sansui, like these on the sliding screens just inside from the garden. Here's the perspective, the beginning of the story. A water journey coming from the high mountains at the very top. One branch of the river runs along the north edge of the building, and the other branch runs along the eastern edge. Both rivers end in oceans. This plan shows the mountain and two rivers area as circled here. Asymmetrical gardens, symmetric building. The North River passes stones resembling cliffs until it reaches a drainage area of pebbles called the Central Sea. The eastern waters flow southward along the building's eastern edge through a simulated mountain valley that includes bridges and pathways, cliffs and islands. It terminates in the southern garden, which is simply a large rectangular bed of white sand representing a great sea. Now back to the real thing. We need to think symbolically. It's like the paintings just inside. A famous scenic mountain in China, Mount Horai, is recreated here in miniature along with the camellia bushes. Of course, it's Mount Shumasen, central to Buddhist myth. It's also called the immovable stone or treasure mountain. Around the upper stream, other large stones are arranged as if the water falls over them as white sand. They are the many symbolic steep mountains nearby. After the water passes in swirling currents down through the steep gorges, some of it rushes out toward us in a way, here, to flow more gently through wider spaces along this north porch. No direct sun. This north garden is backlit from the bright wall. Now, reversing our direction of view, the river flow is away from us here along the north edge, past the mossy island, somewhat in the shape of a turtle, a symbol of longevity, and the shiny flat-top stone, which is good for zazen, sitting, meditating on.
There is the black and white one in the shape of a horse's saddle, and a small island in the background, like a baby turtle, with a central pine tree growing from it.
At the right, there's a stone with a hole, looking like the footmark of Buddha, with a baby turtle islet behind it. Finally, next to Buddha's footprint, there is a stone reflecting the spiritual experience of the monks. Stone of experience. So then the river flows out, that is, under a walkway, into the large sea, a calm pebble lake where the stream has reached peace. Mostly all in the shade, and the sand is all raked daily. A few mountains abruptly rise out of the central sea, helping to better define the tranquility. Now back to the origin of the river, coming out of the high mountains and flowing past the eastern porch. The white sand, as water, flows down the three-level waterfall stones and seems to gush under the bridge and over small falls and on into a large, calm river. First it moves past a stone with wave-like markings. And an island named after another traditional symbol of longevity, the crane. Nice moss and a well-manicured camellia. Some have seen this garden as a kind of three-dimensional mandala, or literal diagram, of the religious universe. And then the water flows under the small footbridge with a traditional kind of window, and over another low falls. The river then flows past a boat-shaped rock like a cargo ship carrying treasure boat stone, and past a reclining sleepy stone like a lazy cow. For present-day monks, it's the river of life, its condition reflecting the human condition as we age and flow toward the great sea of nothingness. Finally, this eastern river flows under the porch and out onto a large sea of calm peace and quiet, much more in the sunlight. The great ocean. This bed of sand is raked carefully every day. It has only a single tree in the far left corner, and these two white sand cones. Symmetry rules herein, this dry garden. Historians say, despite its literalness, the Daisen-in garden displays considerable artistry in selection and use of stones, and achieves a sense of great depth for such a small space. It has a kind of light-hearted playfulness. One sits on the veranda of the temple to meditate on the great ocean. The great ocean. Now we come to tea ceremony. The tea ceremony room at this same temple complex, Chanoyu, the Japanese tea ceremony. Tea drinking was brought into Japan by the Zen priests who drank it to help them stay awake during long hours of meditation. A group of 6 tea drinkers. They used a slightly bitter green tea and tea powder imported from China at first. Caffeine. Our chart again. The Momoyama period and the way of tea developed at this point. Around 1600, tea drinking soon became the center of social gatherings, providing a break from the pressures of everyday life, to sit quietly, relax, and regain some perspective on life. Soon afterward, the Edo period, with its capital changed to Tokyo. Zen spiritual masters became Zen tea masters as well, and the monks could stay awake in meditation and not have to feel the master's sharp stick, which was always ready to hit if one fell asleep. Do not fall asleep. And tea masters were garden designers as well. A mountain retreat landscape. Such retreats served as early tea houses. We need to look back to Chinese landscapes once again here, and Taoism. The tea house gardeners took the scenes typical of a hermit's retreat as the ideal image of nature. Tea houses were usually small, very simple wooden structures, valued for their simplicity. The cult of tea was really Taoism in disguise. These are Japanese paintings, but similar in style to the Chinese ones. They embodied the spirit of nature and naturalness, Taoistic, and the gardens surrounding or leading up to the houses were designed for the same purpose. So this image of the Taoist hermit, coupled with the tea cult, created a new kind of garden used expressly as part of the tea ceremony. Its main feature at the beginning was the pathway, the way in. It recreates the sense of journeying to a hermit's hut. It was called the roji, or dewy path, like the morning dew. It's to help people shake off the everyday life they had just left, to settle their minds, prepare them for entering the tea house. These dewy path roji gardens were some of the first really small-scale gardens. Dewy refers not only to dew settling in the early evening in this case, but also to mental and emotional release from the day's tensions. One man, Sen-no-Rikkyu, almost single-handedly defined the rituals and associated arts of tea drinking. As he said, when you hear the splash of the water drops that fall into the stone tea bowl, you will feel that all the dust of your mind is washed away. This is a modern image of him holding a tea jar and some loose tea in his hand. Both tea connoisseur and gardener, Sen-no-Rikkyu, preferred the dewy paths to be narrow, closed in, and more compact, immediate in their impact. One historian says, the path represents a psychological transition to the tea room's rarefied atmosphere. One is journeying to the home of a hermit and must enter his frame of mind, putting aside all worldly cares. Stones are relatively few and unobtrusive, meant to inspire feelings of profundity and deep contemplation. Often stones are only used for the paths and walkways. Stepping stones protect the moths and guide the way. They oriented and paced the guests through the garden. Stone lanterns were now introduced along these paths to light the way in the evening. Lanterns had not been part of gardens up to now. Permanent stone lanterns soon became a standard ornament of tea garden making. They were even added to earlier gardens. These are a few of the traditional designs, the first three named after famous teamasters who had invented them. Many other lantern styles were developed over the years as well. Along the path, people stopped to wash their hands. That is an echo of Shintoism again, purification.
Finally, they would enter the tea house through a small door, a very small wooden door. One must stoop over in order to enter.
A formal tea room, ready for its master and his guests. Tea vessels are kept ready at the left. One very unusual tea house borders Ryoan-ji tea garden, quite unique, by the Zen priest and gardener Tokei in the 15th century. This is a karesansui, long symmetrical dry mountain and water garden, for observing while drinking tea, sitting on the mats at the left porch. Here's a scene where a drop of water has fallen into a vast sea. According to a Zen teaching, Buddhism is something like the sea. When a drop of rain falls there, a large ripple appears. A human being, by throwing himself or herself into the sea, also causes a great ripple. Jump into Buddhism and see the effect. Other drops fall as well. It is the mind seeking enlightenment in Zen. If you intend to illuminate yourself, you must be willing to throw yourself into the sea of Buddha. Like the raindrop, you will find the way. Here we also have the old yin-yang polarities of Taoism. Inhale, exhale, heaven, earth, male, female. Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, Shintoism, all a bit together now in Japan, but highly refined and austere. People are served tea like this man while contemplating the teachings of the garden.
Another person is especially important, Kobori Enshu, tea gardener of the early 17th century. And this tea garden and tea house by him, called Honshu-in, both especially lovely.
He was a prolific all-round designer and influential tea master. He seemed to favor open gardens, places that were a pleasure to be in. He was also a master of calligraphy and poetry, a multi-talented leader of Japan's early Edo culture. And he designed many tea houses and gardens in Japan, and was tea advisor to the Shogun rulers for 36 years. And Kobori Enshu designed gateways, bridges, ornaments, lanterns, and the shapes and patterns of windows in walls or tea houses. These are all his, a masterpiece in small scale. He's especially remembered for his shakkei technique. Shakkei literally means borrowed scenery, deliberately including some things which are outside the garden in the overall design of the garden itself.
A distant line of hills, or a prominent mountain, or a view across a valley. These would be easily visible from a garden, and this feature could be included in the garden itself. It's using the scenery off there as part of what you make right here. A very useful technique to add depth and a sense of space to small gardens especially. So shakkei is another vital element in basic Japanese garden design.
To sum up then, the garden, like all things, is not unchanging, but what significant changes do occur not within the garden, but in the mind of the viewer and in the perception of the garden. Ultimately, the garden must be viewed as art, and viewed in silence. As a silent sermon, it raises many questions, but asks for no answers.
The garden remains in the mind, and if it can be likened to anything at all, it is the mind itself. The garden exists within ourselves.